Second Lieutenant Edric Vane is standing across the field desk when Brigadier Jeffrey Evans reads the after-action report a second time, sets it down, and says nothing for 90 seconds. Vane does not fill the silence. He has learned, in the last 6 days, that some things are better left where they land. 6 days earlier, he had been certain this report would say something else entirely. That the Gurkha Battalion he had been attached to, as a punishment dressed up as an assignment, would come back the way every unit on this front came back. Bled white against a bunker line that had already broken 7 battalion-strength assaults. He had failed his own frontal action 3 weeks before. He had told himself it was misfortune. He was about to find out it was something else. This is not a story about courage. Every unit in the Arakan in 1943 had courage, and courage alone was killing them by the thousands. This is the story of what one Gurkha battalion did that no other unit on that front had managed, and of the one officer sent to watch them fail, who instead watched everything he believed about soldiering come apart, one uncomfortable fact at a time. If this is the kind of military history that makes you stop and think, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who would appreciate it, because there is a great deal more where this came from. 3 weeks before Donbaik, Vane had planned an assault of his own, a company-strength push against a Japanese outpost on a low ridge east of the Mayu River, textbook in every particular, artillery preparation, a timed advance, flanking sections moving in step. It was the kind of plan that earned good marks at Sandhurst. On the ridge, it earned him 11 casualties and no ground, the Japanese position never so much as suppressed, its fire lifting and falling with a precision that suggested the enemy had known exactly where every man would stand before he stood there. Vane wrote the report himself. He wrote that the ground had favored the defender, that the timing had been thrown by an unexpected rain squall, that the artillery liaison had been half a mile out of position. All of it was true. None of it was the whole of it, and some part of him knew that even as he signed his name. It was easier to believe the plan had been sound and the world unlucky than to believe the plan itself had never had a chance, that the fault sat not in the weather or the ground, but in a doctrine he had never once thought to question, because it was the only one anyone had ever taught him. The order attaching him to the 3rd Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles read as routine, a staff observer sent forward to record and report. Vane read it as something else. No officer with a functioning career was handed to an irregular unit to watch other men solve a problem he had just failed to solve himself. He understood the shape of it without anyone needing to say it aloud. A quiet demotion, dressed in the language of assignment, and beneath that, the particular humiliation of being sent to learn from men he did not consider soldiers in the sense he meant the word. He had seen Gurkha units on the march before, admired their endurance the way one admires a good mule, and assumed the rest was mythology. Hillmen who moved well and struck hard, but without method, without the discipline that separated an army from an armed crowd. Junglecraft, in his private vocabulary, was a polite word for the absence of doctrine. He arrived at their forward position already composing the report he expected to write. Adequate physical stock, no real command structure worth studying, nothing here a properly trained officer could not have improved on in a fortnight. He had not yet watched them do anything. Vane knew the numbers at Donbaik the way a staff officer knows numbers. Precisely, and from a distance. 7 battalion-strength assaults broken against a bunker line held by fewer than 400 Japanese soldiers. Earthworks 2.5 meters deep, roofed in bamboo and log, absorbing artillery that would have leveled a masonry fort. 2,500 British and Indian casualties for ground that had not moved an inch since December. He had read the reports, briefed the figures upward, and filed the whole affair under the heading he filed most Japanese successes in Burma. Superior terrain, inferior information, nothing that better planning could not eventually correct. What he had not done, in all his reading, was ask why 7 attempts by 7 different commanders, each presumably competent, each working from the same manuals he had trained on, had produced the identical result. He had treated it as 7 separate failures of execution, rather than one shared failure of imagination. Standing now at the edge of the position that had swallowed all 7, close enough to hear the particular silence bunkers make when they are not being shot at, Vane still believed he understood the problem. He was about to be handed a demonstration that he did not. The patrol sections went to ground 40 to 60 meters from the Japanese wire and did not move again for 6 days. Vane, briefed on the plan the night before, had assumed this meant something like a forward observation post. men rotating in and out, watching in shifts, gathering what they could between meals and sleep. What he found instead were riflemen lying in the same posture for hours at a stretch, sweating through the heat of the day and shivering through the cold of the night, not shifting their weight, not swatting the insects that walked across their faces, doing nothing he could identify as soldiering at all. He kept his own private tally of the days wasted, the way a man keeps a ledger he intends to present later as evidence. 6 days was a week nearly gone, a week in which a properly aggressive command might have found some other avenue, tried some other angle of approach, done something rather than lain in the wet undergrowth memorizing the habits of sentries who would, in Vane's estimation, still be standing there regardless of how carefully anyone had counted their movements. He did not yet understand what the counting was for. He would understand it exactly once, and by then it would already have happened. On the 5th night, one of the battalion's officers explained it to him without being asked, the way a man explains something he has stopped finding remarkable. The Japanese soldiers' command of the jungle was not a racial gift or a mystical inheritance, whatever the pre-war manuals had implied. It was training, drilled in from the first weeks of service, and training could be studied, matched, and beaten on its own terms. If a man could learn to move 8 kilometers through trackless country by starlight, so could a man who had grown up doing exactly that on the slopes above Pokhara. Vane had no answer for this. He had never considered it a question. Then the sentry rotation the patrols had logged began to run exactly as recorded. The same man at the same post at 3:30 in the morning. The same 15-minute lapse as the relief settled in, night after night, to the minute. Vane checked it against his own watch twice, certain some error would surface. None did. He found himself, against every intention, respecting a piece of intelligence work more thoroughly than he had ever respected one of his own. He did not enjoy the feeling. He did not stop having it. Vane had studied the map before the march began, and studied it the way his training told him to. Contour lines, watercourses, the shaded gray patches his own manuals marked impassable for a formed body of men carrying combat loads. 14 kilometers of ridge and re-entrant country, 2 seasonal streams to cross, the descent onto the Japanese rear timed to arrive in full darkness without a single forward position reporting movement. 72 hours had been allotted. Vane privately doubted the battalion would manage it in 90. He walked with the rear element and watched the column move through terrain he would have called unwalkable in daylight, let alone dark. Down slopes his own boots barely held on. Across water he had assumed would cost them hours in fording, along a route that seemed to read the ground rather than fight it. No man fell. No equipment was lost. When the battalion reached its final position and went to earth, Vane checked his watch out of habit rather than expectation, and found they had covered the entire distance in 44 hours. 11 hours ahead of the time he himself had thought optimistic. He said nothing to the men beside him. There was nothing in his training that explained what he had just watched. The lead section came within 80 meters of the Japanese rear perimeter before a sentry challenged them. A Naik, 3 riflemen, a Bren gunner, close enough now that Vane could hear the low, uncertain call of a man asking who moved in the dark. He braced for the sound he had been trained to expect. A shot, a shout, the collapse of surprise into chaos. What he heard instead was almost nothing. 4 seconds, by his own count against his watch, and the sentry was down without a round fired, without a cry carrying past the nearest tree line. Vane had never been taught this. Sandhurst taught fire and maneuver, taught the rifle and the grenade, taught contact drills built around noise and speed. It had never once taught him that a blade in a trained hand could end a threat more quietly and more completely than any weapon he carried. The section held its position afterward without moving for 11 full minutes, letting the silence settle back into place before advancing again. And in that stillness Vane understood, more plainly than any lecture could have put it, that he had just watched a method he could not file under mythology and could not dismiss as luck. It had simply worked, exactly as intended. At SIL 347, 2 rifle companies broke from cover and crossed 55 meters of open ground toward the rear bunker line, kukris drawn. Vane watched from a fold in the earth 20 meters back, close enough to see it clearly and far enough to be no part of it, the posture in his own body somewhere between an observer's crouch and a man bracing for something he already suspected he could not unsee. The pace was not a rush. It was a controlled, silent sprint, covering that ground in less time than a startled sentry needs to raise a rifle. The first 4 bunkers went down without a shot. At the 5th, a young Japanese officer turned from his position half a second too late, kukri already at the top of its arc above him, his face caught in that instant between recognition and whatever comes after it. Not the abstraction of an enemy on a map, but a particular man, young, afraid, real. Vane did not look away. He made himself watch the half-second complete, and in it, every explanation he had carried into the Iraqan, misfortune, terrain, bad luck, fell away at once, replaced by nothing he yet had words for. Vane wrote the after-action report himself, and found it the hardest document he had ever put his name to, not because the facts were difficult to establish, but because he kept reaching for the language he would have used 3 weeks earlier, bold, aggressive, decisive, and finding none of it fit what he had actually seen. He wrote instead about stillness, about patience measured in days rather than minutes, about a doctrine built on the plain admission that the enemy's advantage was learned and could therefore be unlearned. It read, when he finished it, like a document written by someone else. He carried it to Brigadier Evans and stood across the field desk while the brigadier read it once, then again, then set it down and said nothing for 90 seconds. Vane had expected to fill that silence with some explanation. He found he had none worth offering, and understood, watching Evans's face, that none was needed. That night he opened his own diary for the first time in weeks, and wrote a single honest line, that he had come to Burma certain he already knew how to win it, and that the men he had been sent to judge had taught him, without once trying to, that he did not.